the new god of war, the new gods of war, a new god of war, the new goddess of war, the new goddesses of war, a new goddess of war, the old god of war, the old gods of war, a old god of war, the old goddess of war, the old goddesses of war, a old goddess of war, the greater god of war, the greater gods of war, a greater god of war, the greater goddess of war, the greater goddesses of war, a greater goddess of war, the lesser god of war, the lesser gods of war, a lesser god of war, the lesser goddess of war, the lesser goddesses of war, a lesser goddess of war, the greater spirit of war, the greater spirits of war, a greater spirit of war, the lesser spirit of war, the lesser spirits of war, a lesser spirit of war, the major god of war, the major gods of war, a major god of war, the major goddess of war, the major goddesses of war, a major goddess of war, the minor god of war, the minor gods of war, a minor god of war, the minor goddess of war, the minor goddesses of war, a minor goddess of war, the superior god of war, the superior gods of war, a superior god of war, the superior goddess of war, the superior goddesses of war, a superior goddess of war, the inferior god of war, the inferior gods of war, a inferior god of war, the inferior goddess of war, the inferior goddesses of war, a inferior goddess of war, the ancestor god of war, the ancestor gods of war, a ancestor god of war, the ancestor goddess of war, the ancestor goddesses of war, a ancestor goddess of war, the ascendant god of war, the ascendant gods of war, a ascendant god of war, the ascendant goddess of war, the ascendant goddesses of war, a ascendant goddess of war, the descendant god of war, the descendant gods of war, a descendant god of war, the descendant goddess of war, the descendant goddesses of war, a descendant goddess of war, the transcendent god of war, the transcendent gods of war, a transcendent god of war, the transcendent goddess of war, the transcendent goddesses of war, a transcendent goddess of war, the future god of war, the future gods of war, a future god of war, the future goddess of war, the future goddesses of war, a future goddess of war, the present god of war, the present gods of war, a present god of war, the present goddess of war, the present goddesses of war, a present goddess of war, the past god of war, the past gods of war, a past god of war, the past goddess of war, the past goddesses of war, a past goddess of war, the god of war, the gods of war, a god of war, the goddess of war, the goddesses of war, a goddess of war, the half god of war, the half gods of war, a half god of war, the half goddess of war, the half goddesses of war, a half goddess of war, the vessel of war, the vessels of war, a vessel of war, the person of war, the persons of war, a person of war, the person of war, the personas of war, a person of war, the personage of war, the personages of war, a personage of war, the personality of war, the personalities of war, a personality of war, the personification of war, the personifications of war, a personification of war, the image of war, the images of war, a image of war, the imagination of war, the imaginations of war, a imagination of war, the belief of war, the beliefs of war, a belief of war, the thought of war, the thoughts of war, a thought of war, the word of war, the words of war, a word of war, the action of war, the actions of war, a action of war, the reaction of war, the reactions of war, a reaction of war, the situation of war, the situations of war, a situation of war, the circumstance of war, the circumstances of war, a circumstance of war, the relationship of war, the relationships of war, a relationship of war, the number of war, the numbers of war, a number of war, the formula of war, the formulas of war, a formula of war, the equation of war, the equations of war, a equation of war, the symbol of war, the symbols of war, a symbol of war, the color of war, the colors of war, a color of war, the thing of war, the things of war, a thing of war, the way of war, the ways of war, a way of war, the place of war, the places of war, a place of war, the time of war, the times of war, a time of war, the event of war, the events of war, a event of war, the result of war, the results of war, a result of war, the crown of war, the crowns of war, a crown of war, the working, the workings, the workingdom, the war kingdoms, the working subject, the working subjects, the working's dominion, the working's dominions, the kingdom of war, the kingdoms of war, a kingdom of war, the war queen, the war queens, the war queendom, the war queendoms, the war queen subject, the war queen subjects, the war queen's dominion, the war queen's dominions, the queendom of war, the queendoms of war, a queendom of war, the war prince, the war princes, the war princedom, the war princedoms, the war prince's subject, the war prince's subjects, the war prince's dominion, the war prince's dominions, the princedom of war, the princedoms of war, a princedom of war, the war princess, the war princesses, the war princessdom, the war princessdoms, the war princess's subject, the war princess's subjects, the war princess's dominion, the war princess's dominions, the princessdom of war, the princessdoms of war, a princessdom of war, the leader of war, the leaders of war, a leader of war, the follower of war, the followers of war, a follower of war, the natural form of war, the natural forms of war, a natural form of war, the supernatural form of war, the supernatural forms of war, a supernatural form of war, the temporal form of war, the temporal forms of war, a temporal form of war, the spiritual form of war, the spiritual forms of war, a spiritual form of war, the age of war, the ages of war, a age of war, the awakening of war, the awakenings of war, a awakening of war, the realm of war, the realms of war, a realm of war, the dimension of war, the dimensions of war, a dimension of war, the purpose of war, the purposes of war, a purpose of war, the manifestation of war, the manifestations of war, a manifestation of war, the source of war, the sources of war, a source of war, the origin of war, the origins of war, a origin of war, the ancestor of war, the ancestors of war, a ancestor of war, the descendant of war, the descendants of war, a descendant of war, the lineage of war, the lineages of war, a lineage of war, the forefather of war, the forefathers of war, a forefather of war, the foremother of war, the foremothers of war, a foremother of war, the mask of war, the masks of war, a mask of war, the armor of war, the armors of war, a armor of war, the champion of war, the champions of war, a champion of war, the elemental art of war, the elemental arts of war, a elemental art of war, the elemental science of war, the elemental sciences of war, a elemental science of war, the elemental principle of war, the elemental principles of war, a elemental principle of war, the agent of war, the agents of war, a agent of war, the agency of war, the agencies of war, a agency of war, the amplifier of war, the amplifiers of war, a amplifier of war, the amplification of war, the amplifications of war, a amplification of war, the aura of war, the auras of war, a aura of war, the power of war, the powers of war, a power of war, the authority of war, the authorities of war, a authority of war, the might of war, the mights of war, a might of war, the dominion of war, the dominions of war, a dominion of war, the melody of war, the melodies of war, a melody of war, the rhythm of war, the rhythms of war, a rhythm of war, the dance of war, the dances of war, a dance of war, the music of war, the musics of war, a music of war, the spirit of war, the spirits of war, a spirit of war, the people of war, the peoples of war, a people of war, the mark of war, the marks of war, a mark of war, the promise of war, the promises of war, a promise of war, the vision of war, the visions of war, a vision of war, the language of war, the languages of war, a language of war, the sound of war, the sounds of war, a sound of war, the secret of war, the secrets of war, a secret of war, the knowledge of war, the knowledges of war, a knowledge of war, the understanding of war, the understandings of war, a understanding of war, the wisdom of war, the wisdoms of war, a wisdom of war, the revelation of war, the revelations of war, a revelation of war, the strength of war, the strengths of war, a strength of war, the fortress of war, the fortresses of war, a fortress of war, the city of war, the cities of war, a city of war, the nation of war, the nations of war, a nation of war, the civilization of war, the civilizations of war, a civilization of war,